Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Melissa Deckman, CEO of Public Religion Research Institute, and I want to welcome you to our webinar that is discussing the findings from our latest survey released last week that looks at Americans' attitudes about the causes of political violence and other factors as well. I'm really happy to be joined today by two outstanding scholars who are specialists in race, religion, Christian nationalism, and American politics. They're also, we're happy to say, affiliated scholars with PRRI. That's Eric McDaniel and Sam Perry. Unfortunately, Robbie Jones is ill today, so he's not going to be able to join us for this conversation. But we invite you to submit questions to ask us toward the end of this webinar. So first, I'm going to pass the baton to Eric for his introduction. Eric.
Hi, my name is Eric McDaniel. I'm a professor in the Department of Government at the University of Texas. I'm the co-director of the PRRI Lab. I'm proud to be a PRRI scholar.
Hey, and I'm Sam Perry. I'm professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma and also an affiliated scholar at Public Religion Research Institute. And it's a privilege to be a part of the group and privilege to be doing this kind of work with scholars who are interested in protecting our democracy and preventing the kind of violence that we've seen in recent years. So this work is really important.
Thank you both so much. So let's go ahead and dive into the data. I would also just note that for much more on the survey findings, you can, in fact, go to our website, prri.org, which has, again, much more on the findings with respect to our latest survey here. So our survey is Political Violence in America, Public Perceptions, Polarization, and Accountability. So before I dive into some of the main findings of the survey report, I want to talk a little bit about the survey methodology. So this survey was conducted toward the end of last year among a representative random sample of 5,700 adults. These adults are part of the Ipsos Knowledge Panel. Again, this is very gold standard data when it comes to public opinion research because we have the random element here. So I think it's important to recognize that. And because we have such a large and robust sample size, that means our margin of error for the full sample is pretty low. It's about plus or minus 1.5 points. Okay. So let's begin by looking at Americans' attitudes about drivers of violent actions in society. So we decided to ask Americans what they felt were one of 5 different factors in terms of driving or causing political violence in society. So essentially, did Americans think that the factors we introduced them to contribute a lot to violent actions in society, some, or little at all? And here is essentially the 5 indicators that we queried Americans about. And so we found among 5 different drivers, 2/3 of Americans, 67%, said that political leaders failing to condemn the violent rhetoric of their own followers contributes a lot to violent actions in society, drawing again the most, I think, most frequent response here. Additionally, we found about almost 2/3, 64%, indicated that false or misleading information and images generated by AI that spread on social media are also a main contributor to a lot of violent actions in society. And we found that 6 in 10, 61%, felt that public displays of hate symbols, such as Nazi flags and swastikas, contributed to a lot of violent actions in society. We found majorities, but smaller majorities, felt that both easy access to guns and harsh and violent language in politics contributed a lot to such violence in society. As you might not be surprised to find, however, we find definitely some partisan differences when it comes to these measures. In all of these cases, we found that very strong majorities of Democrats believe that these factors contributed a lot to violent actions in society. Independents in this case look a lot like the national average, but clearly we see that Republicans look very different on many of these measures. So for example, looking at the first line toward the left, we see that, whoops, I kind of went ahead a little bit too quickly. We see a 20-point gap between Republicans and Democrats on that measure. Where we tend to see the least amount of partisan, I guess, difference is when it comes to AI, but we see much bigger breaks when it comes to public displays of hate symbols. So here we see, for example, that Democrats are 20 points more likely than Republicans to indicate that public displays involving Nazi symbols is driving. And we see a huge chasm when it comes to easy access to guns. I think this is speaking, of course, to really the very divergent opinions that Democrats and Republicans have with respect to the regulation of guns. We see that playing out in whether they are causing violent actions in society. And I want to take a closer look at the last part concerning harsh and violent language. So this is not the first time we asked about that specific criteria as a contributor to harsh and violent actions. So for example, in 2019, we found about half of Americans believed at the time that harsh and violent language contributes a lot to violent actions in society. That's went up a little bit slightly in 2021. That was taken right after the events of January 6, 2021. It's now back down to about 53%. And so notably, we find among partisans, though, this trend. So Democrats may be a slightly less likely than they were in 2019 to think that such language contributes a lot of violence. We have seen growth among Republicans from 26% in 2019 to 46% in 2025, which I think is a pretty notable finding. Still not a majority of Republicans are convinced that it's leading to a lot of violent actions in society. Well, I wanted to offer a couple of data points with respect to religion, because that is essentially something we're known for. So if you look at the harsh and violent language and politics measure, which we just looked at with respect to a party lens, we find that majorities of religious Americans, regardless of the group, are likely to say that harsh and violent language in politics is a big contributor to violence. With one exception, white evangelical Protestants are the only group of whom a majority do not say that harsh and violent language in politics is a contributor. We also see, though, far more, I think, variance when it comes to access to guns. Typically, we're finding that Christians of color and non-Christians tend to be much more likely to think that gun access is a problem. Where you're seeing far less of that are white evangelicals and Latter-day Saints. Next, so we wanted to look at this idea of specific criteria, specific acts of violent or hostile actions, whether they would ever be justified to advance your side's political goal. So we're getting into a more specific kind of indicators of what Americans think are acceptable, essentially here. And so we asked about 5 different actions, right? Imprisoning a political opponent without a trial if that person poses a clear danger to the country, damaging property as a form of protest, pushing or shoving or punching a political opponent, so acts of assault, even killing a political opponent if that person poses a clear danger to the country. And finally, we asked about the concept of doxing, right? We hear that this is happening more and more frequently to political leaders, so posting the home address or private phone number of political opponents online so their families will be harassed. So here's a bit of, I think, good news in our survey. And that very few Americans answer political goals. So again, this is, I think, a very positive thing to take away. There's a little bit more of a tendency among Americans to say perhaps imprisoning political opponents without a trial might be acceptable, but here it's only about 12% of Americans. Again, what we're seeing here is really a rejection of those kinds of violent actions. And here, of course, is the flip side of that chart. But I wanted to kind of take a look at those who completely disagree. So if we go back before, I moved a little too quickly here. It was pretty, not only do Americans not agree that these kinds of actions are ever justified, but they're pretty much opposed writ large, completely disagreeing that these kinds of things are ever necessary. But there was one finding with respect to age that we wanted to point out here that is pretty notable. And so what we tended to find, again, looking at those Americans who completely disagree, it's like the most, I think, intense opposition you can have to the use of these kinds of actions in society, we looked at it by different age groups. And what we found is that, generally speaking, older Americans, especially those over 50, tend to be the most completely opposed to, or they're the most likely to completely disagree that these actions are ever justifiable. But under 50, we see definitely more, I think, softening in terms of intensity here. And really among younger Americans in particular, 18 to 29, and really this year, if you think about generational cohorts, the oldest Gen Zers will be turning 29. So here, Gen Z is looking very different when it comes to, their refusal to completely, I think, disagree with these kinds of actions in society. It's not meaning they endorse them, but there's certainly a kind of a softening here among Gen Z when it comes to maybe acceptability of some of these sorts of actions. All right. So I want to turn next to a question that we've been using for a number of years that we developed right after the tragic events of January 6th. And so we have been asking Americans on a regular basis, do you agree that because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country? And so what we have found generally is that most Americans don't agree with this, first of all. But we have found that Republicans have tended to be more supportive of this viewpoint than Democrats compared to when we first asked the question. So let's look at where Americans are today overall. Back when we first started asking that question in 2021, right after January 6th, about 15% of Americans agreed with the statement. It's gone up a little bit to 20% as of this last survey, but a little bit of variation we saw maybe in late 23, a little bit more support for that. But what's really notable are the partisan differences over time. And so we decided to put a line in here when Donald Trump was reelected, because what you'll notice is that, again, through Trump's reelection in late 2024, Republicans consistently were more likely to Democrats to say that, that there might be a need to resort to violence to save the country. And so as of our most recent poll in the field, we're finding really no statistically significant differences between Republicans and Democrats. But really what strikes me is the plummeting of that need for potential violence among Republicans, which to me, after Trump's reelection, is showing that they're pretty happy with, maybe Republicans are pretty happy with the tactics and the policies that Trump is instituting. And so you see, perhaps from their vantage point, less of a need to promote or think about political violence. I want to, however, look at this with respect to our measures of Christian nationalism. So one of the things we do here at PRRI is that we regularly are in the field asking Americans and categorizing them by their propensity to support Christian nationalist views, which is essentially the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation and should remain so. It's a multi-scale measure that we use, and there's much more detail in our current report and, of course, online about how we characterize these folks. But generally speaking, we find about 10% of Americans can be characterized as strong adherents to Christian nationalism, according to our scale. That's been pretty consistent since we started asking about these measures in late 2022. We find an additional 20% roughly are sympathetic, maybe not as strongly adherent to Christian nationalism, but broadly sympathetic to those measures here. And so one of the things we found pretty consistently is that adherents, especially, and sympathizers tend to be more supportive of the idea that true American patriots may have to resort to violence. And again, if you look at it plotted against those who are skeptical of Christian nationalism or those who wholesale reject Christian nationalism, we are still finding that Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers are still more likely to agree with this. But again, similar to the numbers that we saw with respect to partisanship, we're seeing a little bit of a decline when it comes to support for this view among adherents and sympathizers in wake of Trump's reelection. All right, next we're going to turn to some other variables and other questions that we asked in our survey. We wanted to get a sense of who Americans thought was most responsible for political violence. And so we asked Americans the degree to which they agree that left-wing groups or right-wing groups are more responsible for political violence today. And Americans are evenly split. 41% of Americans say that left-wing groups are responsible for most political violence, compared with 44% of Americans who say that right-wing groups are most responsible for political violence today. And this won't be shocking to any of you if you follow news about politics, but there's a clear party polarization happening when it comes to responsibility for political violence. We find, for example, that 7 in 10 Republicans believe that left-wing groups are responsible for most of the political violence we're seeing today. that's almost a mirror image of the 73% of Democrats who say that it's right-wing groups who are responsible for most political violence. I think it's interesting here that independents break a little bit more toward the Democratic position than the Republican position. 45% of independents believe that right-wing groups are responsible for most political violence compared to 35% of independents. And if we look at it with respect to religious affiliation, we collapse some of those larger categories into four groups. And here we find that white Christians are a majority are more likely to attribute left-wing groups to attribute violence to left-wing groups compared to Christians of color, non-Christians, and the religiously unaffiliated, either half of whom are majorities are more likely to say that right-wing groups are responsible. We had a question also on the survey that asked about the deployment of the National Guard into American cities. We were writing this at a time when Trump was gearing up to send the National Guard into the District of Columbia, which is where PRRI is based, and obviously has done so in other cities, often in blue cities where mayors and governors are not happy about having them there. But nonetheless, we wanted to get a sense of whether Americans felt that deploying the National Guard would cause more violence than it prevents. And we find here that Americans are more likely to agree that such a deployment causes more violence, about 52% than disagree with that notion, which is about 44% here. But not surprisingly, partisans view this very, very differently. Again, Democrats are much more likely to think that deploying the National Guard will lead to violence, whereas Republicans think it actually will prevent violence as well. Again, independents look closer to Democrats when it comes to this idea than they do Republicans. Again, returning to the Christian nationalism groups I introduced before, here again, we see very big differences based on whether Americans adhere to Christian nationalist views. Those that completely reject Christian nationalism are far more skeptical that the Guard will do anything to really prevent violence. You know, close to, I think 8 in 10 basically say that that deployment of the National Guard will cause more violence. And we see again different numbers when it comes to those Americans who are sympathetic or adherent to Christian nationalist views. We also had a question on Trump's January 6th pardons that we wanted to talk about today. Of course, that was one of the first things that President Trump did about a year ago when he became president again, January 20th. And so we wanted to see whether or not Americans thought that pardoning those more than 1,500 people convicted for their role in the attacks on the Capitol was justified. Most Americans do not favor such an action. In fact, we find that about 78%, more than 3 in 4, oppose that action by President Trump. But Republicans are far less likely to oppose that action. And in fact, we find that strong majorities thought that this was a good thing for President Trump to do. Democrats, of course, far more likely to strongly oppose this action. Again, notable, independents look a lot more like Democrats on this measure than they do Republicans. And this probably won't shock you given what you've seen before, but we find that Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers are much more likely to say that this was a good decision by President Trump. We also asked about views on protesters, right? I'm thinking about this question, especially in wake of what's happening right now in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota. So we wanted to ask Americans that, do they agree that when Americans speak up and protest unfair treatment by government, it makes our country better? And we've asked this about 3 times historically, starting in 2015, when about 63% of Americans said yes. When Americans essentially using their First Amendment rights to protest, it's a good thing in American society. And that's actually gone up slightly in our most recent survey. Notably, we find there is a strong partisan divide when it comes to that. This is a right that Democrats, I think, embrace more than Republicans, but we've seen a growing split. Back in 2015, there was really no difference between Republicans and Democrats. Today, we're seeing, you know, at least a 26 point gap between partisans on this issue. I think we're coming down to the end. And so we asked a question about citizenship, given the crackdown we're seeing with the Trump administration. So we asked Americans, do you agree that stripping U.S. citizens of their citizenship and deporting them if they're determined to be a threat to the country here? Here we find only 41% of Americans agree with that idea. Again, strong majorities of Republicans, 60% agree, compared to only 27% of Democrats. And plotting and looking at the data with respect to religion, most people of faith and those who are unaffiliated disagree with this idea, but white evangelical Protestants are the only religious group of whom a majority agree with this sort of policy. Right. So that's in a nutshell, most of our survey's major findings. So I want to pass the baton to Eric to share some of his thoughts about what our survey found.
Thank you,
Eric.
Melissa. Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that. One of the things that first stood out to me is looking at the age gap is you have this clear line, delineation between the boomers and the silent generation and then Gen X. And I think it's very important to note that amongst the boomers and the silent generation, they went through extreme turmoil of the 50s and 60s. So where they saw presidents, they saw the assassination of a president, they saw multiple killings, church bombings, things like that. So they've seen that firsthand. And I think it's an experience they don't want to live through again. But also it could be an aspect of age that factors into this. But I really do think it's these experiences that are more important. Now, nothing that stood out to me is looking at um, some of this is we also need to be aware of groups who have a history of being the target of political violence. That they're when we think of white evangelicals and we think of whites in general, we don't think of them as being targets of political violence. We think of women, we think of members of the LGBTQ plus community, blacks, and non-whites as being uh, being the targets of this violence. And so it's interesting to see how they wrestle with this. But you're also finding, at least looking at blacks, there is a very small but not ignorable size of that seem to be open to some aspects of political violence. This could be an aspect of thinking about self-defense. This could also be in the sense of, you know, we've tried the nice way, we tried democracy, it doesn't work. And also speaks to what some people have pointed out too as a sense of a growing sense of black nihilism, where black people have kind of given up on the nation and its ability to have progress. And so it's all kind of interesting to be talking about this the day after the King holiday, where it was about the idea of hope and nonviolence. But even King had to be convinced about nonviolence. So during the Montgomery bus boycott, he had armed guards and several guns in his house. Uh, that this idea of nonviolence is still being debated quite a bit. But I think the history of being targeted, as well as just a complete and utter distrust of the institutions, has led some people to be more open to that. And so I think it's very important to be aware of these things as we look at how people are responding. That some people have lived through this turmoil, and some people have a history of being the targets, and this may influence how they think about political violence.
Thank you, Eric. I want to pass the baton to Sam for some of his thoughts.
Yeah, I really appreciated Eric's thoughts. Just piggybacking on the age issue for a second, I think totally understand the idea that the older Americans in the survey may have lived through these circumstances and felt like that we're not going back to that kind of situation. It also strikes me that maybe young people, given the current state of economics, in job opportunities, student loan debt, and feeling largely abandoned by an economy and a political class that is not thinking for their interests and and what would help them. I wonder if young people are more likely to endorse the possibility of violence, given that they feel like they have a lot less to lose, whereas older Americans who are invested in their jobs and 401ks and mortgages feel like, hey, this is, they're more likely to be moderate and like, hey, let's, go through the regular channels rather than be a little bit more radical, which young people may feel like they have a need to do that. A couple of other things jump out about the findings. I appreciated just your figure, Melissa, about showing how the changes in across, say, Christian nationalism and partisanship in endorsing the idea that true American patriots may have to resort to physical violence in order to save the country. That's a really important question. I'm glad you guys have been asking that. PRI has been asking that for years now. I think I noticed two things immediately, though. One, we see some obvious variation in just who happens to be in charge, like the president at the time, but it doesn't invert completely. So, in other words, like when you ask about like presidential approval, it inverts completely by whoever happens to be the party that's just in charge. But in this case, even with Trump in charge post his assassination attempts, you're still more likely to have Republicans and adherents of Christian nationalism still more likely to say true patriots may have to resort to violence, whereas rejectors are more likely to say, that's not where still less likely to endorse that kind of idea. That suggests to me two things. One, some of the justification for that kind of political violence is obviously motivated by who's in charge and who's in control at the time and threats to your own political power. But there is some level of ideological support that is not completely erased, right? Like, in other words, some ideological belief systems or some sets of justifications, permission structures really do justify the violence, even when you are in charge, even when your group is in power and you feel like have the wind at your back in terms of like you're in control of both houses of Congress and the presidency and the judiciary. And so that one seemed obvious. Getting on the topic of Christian nationalism for a second, I want to say that I think, and I try to say this every chance I get, PRRI has I think developed a really great set of Christian nationalism questions. I think scholars have been trying to capture this idea of Christian nationalism in various surveys, and I think PRRI has the best thing going. And so I just suggest that most scholars who want to study this, if you're still doing survey research in these areas, I think you could do a lot worse than just adopt PRI's measures so that we have like a really consistent set. They've got great face validity. They're very reliable, really consistent. And I think that's the state of the art. But some of the things that stick out in not the presentation, but the data themselves, as I was looking at the breakdown in how, say, people who espouse Christian nationalist beliefs respond to these various outcomes that PRI asked about. We have to talk about white Christian nationalism. So it's Christian nationalism, yes, seems to incline Americans toward more reactionary and right-wing views as it relates to violence and political power. And yet, when we break it down by which Christian nationalists, it tends to be white Americans rather than, say, black Americans. At the very least, it's not black Americans. So I'll give you some examples. On various outcomes that have to do with gun violence. We find that the more white Americans subscribe to Christian nationalism, the more they don't think gun violence has anything to do with political violence. Whereas for black Americans, whether they respond to Christian nationalism or not, or however they think about it, they don't seem to, it doesn't seem to change their views. They actually do think it's gun violence, even black Americans who subscribe to Christian nationalism. Same thing for pardoning January 6ers. Black Americans, even those who subscribe to Christian nationalism, think that was a bad deal. Same thing with believing that right-wing groups are the source of most violence. Black Americans who subscribe to Christian nationalism still think it's right-wing groups. The deployment of the National Guard. Black Americans who subscribe to Christian nationalism think that's a problem and think that's going to contribute to violence, whereas white Americans do not. And so, just as a reminder, I think this data reminds me that it's just one more data point that when we're talking about Christian nationalism, we really have to consider, at least in the data, whether or not what we're really talking about here is at least non-black Christian nationalism, but more likely white Christian nationalism. And just one more thought here is I thought it was a great. This is where confidence in the American public. I think they scored a victory here when they said the largest percentage said. It is political leaders who are failing to condemn political violence that are most to blame here. I think the political science research would back that up. I think grassroots Americans respond to elite rhetoric, polarizing and demonizing elite rhetoric. And it's bad news when we have conflict entrepreneurs and political pundits who are stoking this kind of outrage and fear and anxiety. And they're doing it intentionally to score victories at the polls and to engagement farm on social media and to do those kinds of things. And I think the American public rightly knows that is a lot to blame. And so to turn back the tide on that kind of rhetoric, there needs to be mobilization happening. There needs to be courageous leadership among pastors and political leaders to condemn that kind of rhetoric, and all of us to condemn it whenever we see it, because I do think that is the research shows that really is a large part of why this is happening.
Thank you, Sam, Eric, both of you for those comments. I actually want to pick off where Sam left off. I'm going to share what I think are some of the most interesting findings, the things that I'm still thinking about a week after having read the survey and kind of sat with the data. I would agree also with Sam that the finding that most Americans, right, 67% say that political leaders failing to condemn violence from their own followers is a big contributor. To me, this is a finding that indicates a strong desire among Americans to have political leaders play a bigger role in turning down the temperature. Americans want this, right? And as Sam pointed out, studies of political violence know that strong leaders, community leaders, as well as visible political leaders nationally and locally really do play a big role in, I think, tamping down some of the rhetoric and turning down the political heat. Eric, I was also thinking about MLK this week in wake of the celebration of his birthday. I think about his assassination, and a lot of people point rightly to RFK and his pivotal role, right after that assassination, really turning down the temperature. I think in Indianapolis, really calling on nonviolent measures, but it was a leadership role that I think many Americans would like to see their own political leaders, and actually political leaders on both sides of the aisle. I think embracing this kind of uh, role. But I think the other problem, though, is that if you look further down, getting us to that moment is going to be hard, not least of which, Sam, this is a new term to me, conflict entrepreneurs. I'm writing that down. That's a good term. We have really a situation where Democrats, attribute responsibility to right-wing groups when it comes to propagating most political violence. Republicans attribute responsibility to left-wing groups. I should also note, however, a lot of scholars who study this point to strong evidence that violence is more likely to be committed by right-wing extremists. But nonetheless, if we look at the partisans, when partisans have strong views about who is actually doing the violence, it often becomes, I think, more difficult for some leaders to really call their own followers to task who have committed that kind of violence. I think, of course, the additional challenge too is President Trump himself, right? This is a leader. Studies show, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. Trump, compared to other presidents, has employed far more divisive and antagonistic language, especially when addressing political opponents. And so, I think that the expectation that Trump will suddenly decide to speak to his better angels and ask for calm in America is probably unrealistic. And so the incentive structures that we have from the very top that really are these attention economy rewards are really, it's hard to get, I think, political leaders to take that kind of responsibility. And of course, we find Americans increasingly are in their own sort of echo chamber, so they're only hearing from one side of the aisle and not the other. So Americans want political leaders to play a bigger role, but there are certain, I think, incentive structures in place that make it a challenge at this moment in American politics. I also wanted to actually talk about the role of deep fakes by AI. That emerged as the second most frequent reason that Americans believe are a contributor to political violence. And to me, it's really speaking of a growing recognition of the potential harms that AI poses to Americans, but also to our democracy. A couple of years ago in our American Values Survey in late 2023, we asked Americans about issues that were critical to them, right? And so we asked about artificial intelligence back late 2023. Only 20% of Americans said it was a critical issue. I suspect if we were to poll on that today, we'd see much bigger increase in terms of AI because AI is becoming more ubiquitous in our daily lives. We, of course, have become familiar with the idea of AI slop. That's pervading a lot of our social media feeds. And some of it's completely harmless, cats and trees and whatnot. But really, the problem for our democracy is that it can promote political disinformation and contribute to political instability. And of course, I think lead to potentially the notion that political violence might be necessary. I would also add here, maybe gets away from the current study, but more and more studies looking at AI disinformation finds that it's also particularly harmful for women political leaders and promotes what George Washington professor Spencer Overton describes as ethno-nationalism by algorithm. So what I'm seeing here, this data is showing Americans are very concerned about AI and its impacts on political violence, on our democracy. We need more regulation, but without that kind of regulation, Overton, for example, argues that chatbots will be used to sow disinformation, racial distrust, civic disengagement. Um, Finally, I wanted to talk about that series of questions, what I would call the Nazi problem that the GOP is facing today, right? We saw that only about half of Republicans felt that symbols such as swastikas were a contributor of political violence. Far more Democrats were likely to say that. A strong majority of Americans agree with that. And we have seen in the past several years, maybe even starting really with Trump's first presidency in 2017, after that deadly white nationalist rally that took place in Charlottesville, Trump was really widely criticized for saying there were fine people on both sides of that aisle. Nick Fuentes, who's really kind of given new life in these kinds of these engagement forums, I think is maybe another term that I'm bringing from this conversation from Sam. So a lot of young people follow Nick Fuentes. Trump has been reluctant to criticize Nick Fuentes, but yet Nick Fuentes is a huge anti-Semite, right? And so we know there are other stories that have come out in the last couple of months. There was a Telegram chat, for example, earlier this year, in which young Republican activists were glibly invoking Hitler and the Holocaust. Just last, I think, at the end of the year, stories came out about a Nashville focus group conducted by the Manhattan Institute, looking at 20 right-leaning Gen Zers, mostly Trump voters. Again, many of them praised Nick Fuentes. There was a startling normalization of white supremacist views in that series of focus group, including praising Hitler and really repeating sort of anti-Semitic tropes. So I think this is something that the GOP needs to, I think, be talking about and really repeatedly and more vociferously, decrying, because I think most Americans, I would have thought, would say that such symbols would be really bad in America and have no place in America. I guess finally, the last point I would say in terms of the positive news, I agree with Sam that the finding that most Americans are rejecting specific forms of violence is a good one. Whether it's assaulting Americans to advance your political goals or, doxing folks. But another positive takeaway for me, especially with what's happening right now in Minneapolis, is that most Americans view protesters as making our country better, right? So we asked Americans, when Americans speak up to protest mistreatment by the government, does it make our country better or not? And again, we find that fully 2/3 of Americans endorse that really critical and I would say sacred First Amendment right. So that leaves me some hope as we're heading into really to what's going to be, I think, another tumultuous year, unfortunately, in American politics. So with that said, I wanted to turn to some of your questions or give really Eric and Sam the opportunity to offer some additional insights not raised yet. Eric.
I was going to say thank you so much, Melissa and Sam, for your comments. I think they were very helpful comments about thinking through this. And Sam, I'm thinking about what you pointed out about the fact that political leaders playing such a big role, where political science has studied the role of fear and anger and how that gets people to pay attention and to act. So if you want people to pay attention to you and focus solely on you, you make them scared. If you want to get off the vote, you make them angry. And so we're seeing that the way in which politicians behave, but also the way in which social media behaves is very similar.
Right.
And I'm thinking about social media. I'm thinking about the sensationalism of papers during the turn of the 20th century, where you had the yellow journalism, just all different types of sensationalism, and that the Spanish-American War kind of, in some ways, kind of like, oh, we need to pull back on this. Um, and there is something to be said about the need to regulate. And but I also think one of the things that's important to pay attention to as well is really the collapse of civic life. That I think because people are just sitting in front of a machine, not talking to other people, this allows these ideas to come together. And the fact that they're watching somebody like Nick Fuentes on screen, they're not actually around him, that it's so much easier, and it's really become kind of a cult of personality, where you know somebody has a good backdrop, and all of a sudden you believe that they're very good at what they do. I mean, we've seen this problem with some people with churches. We see this clearly with politicians, that people who are good at televising themselves get a lot more attention even if the argument they're making is completely false. Um, but then also, Melissa, when you pointed out about the Black America about Americans and protest, I remember a few years ago, the PRI asked questions about, when Americans protest is good for the nation. But the follow-up question was when Black Americans protest is good for the nation. And all of a sudden you saw a steep drop. And the that steep drop was steepest amongst white evangelicals who are, when we think of the Christian nationalist movement, are that. And this speaks to this idea of who really is American. So the question of, true patriots. Well, who are the true patriots? uh, that we celebrated King yesterday, but the whole time he was seen as a traitor. So now he's become a patriot. But uh, and again, I think it goes back to who do we think of as the patriots and who is being targeted by this violence?
I think those are great points, Eric. We didn't have enough room in the survey to kind of delineate between the race of those who were protesting. As you astutely noted, though, we did that in part because of what was happening with Black Lives Matter. And we did find very big differences, especially among sort of those ethno-religious sorts of characterizations, with white Christians being a lot more skeptical about the right for African Americans to have that kind of right. But if we had more resources, I would love to kind of replicate that as well. Although it's notable to me that if you're looking at what's happening in Minneapolis right now, it tends to be primarily white protesters. It's also a city, I think, that probably has a higher proportion of white Americans, but I think there's something going on there that is really interesting that we should be talking about. Even the No Kings protest here in Washington. I mean, it was a lot of those wine moms that are apparently a threat to democracy now. A lot of middle-aged, older women who are like, I'm not having any of it. That seemed to be, from my perspective in DC, at least at that protest, it tended to be those kinds of folks who were protesting. But I think that kind of begs a larger question that we might be wanting to examine. Sam, I want you to jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think Eric at the beginning of his comments talked about black nihilism, but I think nihilism, especially among younger people, younger voters, and just the general public, due to things like misinformation and polarization, I think is part of the plan, right? Like a nefarious plan involved of if we, as Steve Bannon said, flood the zone with shit, right? If we so pardon the language, but I just mean like if it's the idea of if we sow so much information out there that the media has no idea what to do with and what is true, what is false, that involves deep fakes, that involves everything on social media, but it is engagement farming, it's distraction, it's all of those kinds of things. Then I think people eventually just become like, what do I believe? Who is right? And I think in that situation, you end up just going with tribalism. You go with fear. You go with your lizard brain of like fear and anger, rather than processing through like policy, rather than thinking through like my own interests economically in terms of policy and all those kinds of things. So we fail to think, so it is very much a part of the plan. It is not accidental that social media could be leveraged to sow disinformation, make people mad. That we have imported that, right? Like from other countries where like democracy has been destabilized and autocratic or authoritarian leaders have already gained power, and those populations think elections don't really matter and who cares, and it's just like as long as I'm just left alone, rather than taking ownership of democracy and feeling like there's some hope. And so I think there is, we talked about how like this kind of people I think do recognize that like they don't want leaders sowing this kind of discord and violent kind of rhetoric, and yet they will keep on doing that as long as it scores victories at the polls during the midterms and every 4 years. And so that it requires mobilization. It requires people saying enough is enough, and I will not accept that kind of rhetoric from politicians. Um, but that takes a lot of grassroots work. It takes a lot of door knocking. It takes a lot of effort to get that kind of happening in place. And so I hope to see more of it.
Absolutely. I should note, someone made in the comment section, which I appreciate, that there have been many indigenous tribes that are protesting in Minneapolis as well. So I think that's a fair point. So thank you for pointing that out. Um, Sam and Eric, what do you think about like moving forward from your own research in terms of, well, two things. One, what questions should we be asking about trying to combat political violence from your perspective? And secondly, is there anything that from your own research that you think has been overlooked in our study?
I think one of the things that people have been finding is looking at the relationship of Christian nationalism and some of these attitudes is that church attendance seems to negate this. That the group we're most concerned about are the Christian nationalists who are not engaged in the congregation. And what that to me speaks to is maybe a need to pay attention to civic life in general. Are people, part of clubs or organizations? And I think this loneliness epidemic feeds into this sense of fear and anger. That if you're actually around other people, it's it makes you feel more safe, more secure. We're in neighborhoods now where neighbors don't speak to each other. And again, that's because we've become a much more transitory society. We are trying to be the multicultural liberal society that we wanted to be, but I don't think we prepared ourselves for it properly. And there needs to be looking at how we're seeing these organizations come to, who's joining organizations, what kind of organizations are they joining, and then what happens, what is the political outcome of that?
Yeah, just piggybacking on what Eric said, just to cite a recent example, PRI in their September survey asked Americans about support for a policy that would encourage only certain Americans to have babies to preserve a demographic status quo. This is a pretty right wing, like, pretty selective pronatalist kind of view. And I ran some numbers on that, and obviously, like, as you might suspect, Christian nationalism was strongly associated, but it was actually only infrequent attenders, like who are strong Christian nationalists. In other words, it was people who subscribe to this idea that we're a Christian nation, we need to preserve that kind of thing, but they're relatively disconnected from like religious community. It wasn't people who are like really involved in their religious community. And so it suggests that I think a lot of this action or this inclination towards the most reactionary views, and I just used one example of just like a really reactionary kind of promotion of a policy. I think it really is. It is people who subscribe to this identity or this Christian identitarianism, like this idea that like the nation belongs to us and it must be preserved. But they're not finding this. They're not having that tempered or challenged within a faith community that says like, hey man, that's actually really not cool at all, and that's and we we need to celebrate difference and those kinds of things. I think there can be real work done within a community that is positive, that is good, that is holding people accountable. And just to use another example of that, a grad student at Notre Dame, Amy Grawley, she recently published a study using PRRI's not data but measures of Christian nationalism. And she found that when people were exposed to messages from political leaders about Christian nationalism, for or against it, she found that actually it does move people. Like when leaders say, "I'm a Christian," and this Christian nationalism stuff is really associated with some bad stuff. It's bad news, and it's un-American, it's un-Christian, and it actually does move people, not at the extremes, but most of the Americans who are kind of in the middle here, who don't know what to think about it, it actually made them say, "Oh, okay, maybe this is not something I want to subscribe to. I don't want to identify with this kind of thing." And so when I say courageous leadership, it's not just the politicians who need to step up and put their necks out. It actually is faith leaders or community organizers. It's people who are willing to violate what we call a pluralistic ignorance. So pluralistic ignorance is this idea that you think everybody else holds this view. So you stay quiet, even though if you just asked, right, not everybody holds that view. And so it takes a couple of people sticking their necks out and saying, "I don't believe that. Do you believe that? I'm not down for that at all." And then more people say like, "Yeah, I don't like that either." And you can actually turn the tide there. So it takes at grassroots level, pastors, leaders, political leaders to challenge this kind of narrative. And I hope we see more of it.
Well, just going back to Minneapolis again, I do think that one of the things I really like about our data at PRI is that we show repeatedly that there's no monolithic religious position on a variety of indicators right here. But most people of faith consistently reject political violence in this case. But in looking at what's happening in Minneapolis, I've been really struck by the role of clergy being on the front lines and willing to kind of fight back against these tactics being used by ICE. And I think that that's an important kind of example where courageous leadership can make a difference potentially. Because it's very clear that public opinion, we don't have data right now on that, right it from fresh from the field, but it's pretty clear from other polls that what's happening there and in other cities is not necessarily what folks signed up for as well. Final point for me, and we have maybe about 5 more minutes left if folks have another question, is getting back to Eric's point about social isolation and thinking about young people in particular. We have found at PRI, when we've asked about social connection, meaningful connection, that young people are more likely to kind of say that they're lacking that. They're turning to online sources for good or for bad. There's no gender difference, by the way. I know that there's a lot of attention about young men in the crisis there, but it's also equally for young women as well. But I do think that again is playing a factor because those folks are more susceptible to narratives they're hearing that aren't real. So I think it's something as well that kind of monitoring that more closely as a way to support and prevent democratic backsliding, I think is something that's really important. It's just very hard, right? Because you can't force people out of their houses, right? You have to give them a compelling reason to want to be involved in civic life and civic engagement. And for young people, as we've all noted, when they can't move out of their parents' basement to begin with to pay rent, or they really feel like the odds are really stacked against them, which you see repeatedly, even in that focus group that I talked about, that garnered headlines for such really anti-Semitic views by some, Republican young supporters. If you look at the actual focus group, most of what people were complaining about was the economy, right? So you have this perfect storm of people feeling as though their future isn't bright, being susceptible to hearing this misinformation and violent rhetoric, which is unfortunately more, I think, ubiquitous. Final minute or two, any concluding thoughts from Sam or Eric?
I'll let Eric finish and I'll just jump in real quick. I think, Melissa, I thought immediately about like this idea of like getting people involved and connected in ways that are not just online. Read a book recently, and this isn't a place to plug books, but I read a book recently by Ryan Burge, a recent one called The Vanishing Church. And he's a political scientist who mobilizes a lot of data, is a good follow on social media. But he talks about how uh, really the what we all know about the moderates being the ones who are leaving churches and their churches disappearing, and all you have left is really extreme secularism or really right wing Christianity, and so like no people congregating next to others who share different political beliefs, and they are involved in civic life and connected to people that they know who also share similar Christian beliefs, but it's either strongly right wing people or they're just out of church completely. And I do think that is I try to encourage as many people as I can, to the extent that they feel safe and comfortable, to try to resist the urge of just chucking it all and just saying like, hey, this is, there's no place. I'm done with all of this. But rather taking a little bit of enough ownership to say like, hey, I'm going to fight it out in this place, and I'm not going to let folks take the narrative of what Christianity means for me or for anybody else, and I'm gonna fight for the space that I feel like is the place of my community. And so again, to the extent that people feel safe and not targeted or that kind of thing, but it's what I try to do with my family, even though I probably disagree politically with so much of what goes on in the congregations that I'm a part of, and yet it's how we resist polarization in our own life, and it's how we understand one another, and so we at the individual level we play our parts that way.
Kind of going along with what Sam was putting out there, was talked about. And I think something we've also talked about with this sense of fear and anger, especially this uncertainty about their future and what's going on in the world. What Christian nationalism provides is this idea of a God who will control everything and will take control. So it's no longer understanding Christ as the Lamb of God, but as a conqueror. And having somebody like that as a conqueror makes you feel safe. So I remember a lot of people kept talking about, I feel safe. They were threatened by multiculturalism. They were threatened by the economy. And having somebody who would speak in this tone made them feel safe. Having a pastor who would uh, basically preach fire and brimstone about how your enemies are going to suffer and we must punish them makes you feel safer, even though that's not the reality. That you are not threatened as much as you think, and this may actually end up harming you more than helping you. But in the moment, because you felt that fear and that insecurity, you now feel safe here. And even if it's a lie, you know it's a lie, it's very difficult to leave that because you want to live out that fantasy.
I think those are terrific comments that are thought-provoking and leave us kind of maybe thinking about, looking ahead to future surveys and to kind of mulling over some of these, I think, results, uh, in the days ahead. I want to thank both Sam and Eric for coming here and providing their insightful commentary about the survey findings. I would encourage you to, and the audience, to please go take a look at the survey report itself. You can find more information. Our top lines are, press release, and really just more information about what we study on a regular basis, including Christian nationalism. We've heard a lot of conversation about that. And again, pleased to have two leading experts on that topic here. At any rate, please, thank you so much for coming. Follow our LinkedIn page. We're on a variety of social media, including Blue Sky and Threads. But please take a look at our work, follow our work, and please pass along to people that you know. Thank you so much. Have a good day.